Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening or good morning, depending upon where you're at. This is Dr. Patrick Lockwood coming back to you live again to discuss another topic that might not be discussed as much again in the world, but I think it's relevant when we talk about mental health and having good relationships and living a good life. I think, that's the point of me doing these videos, is to talk about topics that are really relevant to who we are and what we want in terms of having a better life. And hey, Colleen, good to see you. Glad you're here. And I wanted to talk about self-esteem today because I think, it's a relevant topic no matter what period in history we're in and no matter what we're discussing in terms of physical health, mental health, social health, family, friends, relationships. I think it's kind of ubiquitous. And I think there are some myths that I'd like to dispel about self-esteem, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the science of the self in the first place, and different philosophies that talk about the self, and kind of figure out what the real truth is there in terms of self-esteem and the self, so that we can maybe live a better life and have a little less anxiety and have better relationships. That's kind of the goal of this video. Understand the self, understand self-esteem, and dispel some myths about it so we can have a better life. So first I want to talk about, thanks Perry, yes, definitely a huge deal in addiction and recovery, very big deal. Any treatment center you go to, any therapist you see, you're going to probably hear about self-esteem in a group or in a session, and that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So before we talk about what self-esteem exactly is and what it really is, and then what we really need to do to have a better sense of self-esteem, I want to talk about what the research shows, because again, my goal in all these videos is to bring some science to the table and not just, have ad hoc ideas and just speak from opinion, because I think opinion is destructive. But here's what the science says about self-esteem. So psychology has been researching this concept of self-esteem basically since the 1900s, early 1900s. And there's been a lot of research on narcissism and self-esteem and depression and self-esteem and behavior and self-esteem. And here's what the broad strokes of the research are. So when it comes to kids and self-esteem, we know these things to be true. For instance, basically children with what are described to have low self-esteem typically more often engage in bullying behavior. They're also more likely to be bullied. They're also more likely to act out using what they call externalizing behavior. So they might be overeating, they might be sexually acting out in childhood, or they might be engaging in drug and alcohol use behavior. So the relationship is between low self-esteem, bullying, being bullied, overeating, sexual acting out, and drug and alcohol use. And I have some resources for you to check out and fact check me on that. The second thing that the research shows about self-esteem is that, thanks, I absolutely love the research on this. It's very important, Colleen, very, very important. The second thing that the research shows about self-esteem is that, generally speaking, there is a strong relationship between low self-esteem and depression. Now, there's a chicken and the egg argument out there in the world of psychology, social psychology, and neuroscience about which one relates to which, but it's there. And people with low self-esteem are also more often angry and withhold their anger. So that's the second thing the research shows. The third thing that the research shows, which might make sense, might not make sense actually, is that it's actually not wise for us to try and kind of globally boost self-esteem. So someone who theoretically has low self-esteem, it's actually not wise to try and artificially boost it, because that can actually turn into narcissism. Because again, the concept of self-esteem is actually a very shallow concept. And I'll talk about that more when I talk about what self-esteem actually is. But the research shows that if you try to artificially boost self-esteem, it actually can have negative consequences, like creating a more narcissistic personality style, or it can actually lead to more acting out, externalizing behavior like drug and alcohol use, excessive sexuality, things of that nature. And the research basically shows that the alternatives, the best alternatives to healthy self-esteem, is to actually develop a healthy sense of self-compassion, kind of through a mindfulness perspective. And there are different ways to boost self-compassion through either exercise, there's research on that, or living a better social life, developing better self-care habits, better hobbies, things of that nature. Because again, what we think of as self-esteem is really a very deep thing, but how we describe it in psychology, unfortunately, is a very, very shallow understanding of the self and who we are. So that's what the research basically shows. In kids, low self-esteem, and in adults probably, is related to externalizing behavior, acting out, sexual compulsivity, drug and alcohol use, bullying, and internalizing anger, and being more depressed. That's what low self-esteem is related to. And the better alternative, according to the research, is actually developing a sense of self-compassion, because that will actually help us grow and develop a sense of security about who we are. So, Cher asked how many publications I'm using for this. I have about 15 to 20 different publications I'm citing right now, and there are hundreds more that can support the same ideas I'm discussing here. So I want to talk about self-esteem and what it actually is, because I think we have some misconceptions about what self-esteem really is. So if you were to ask a random person on the street, you know, do you have high self-esteem, do you have low self-esteem? They might answer, yeah, of course I have high self-esteem. Or they might say, no, I have low self-esteem. And they might be right and they might be wrong. So when you think about just the literal textbook definition, dictionary definition of self-esteem, it means to have high regard or regard for the self. That's what that literally means. However, this becomes kind of tricky and kind of complicated depending upon how you understand the self to be. So most people on the planet, just regular average people, define themselves based upon their job, their relationships, their character traits like being smart or stupid or industrious or boring or lazy or a drug addict or a businessman or gay or straight or any of those things. And I think the reality is there's some validity to that kind of checking off the boxes phenomenon to define who we are as people. This becomes complicated though when it comes to kind of your life philosophy, because depending upon your philosophy about life, there either is a self or there isn't a self. So I've studied Buddhism for many years, and I'm a big proponent of that particular philosophy for many reasons. And if you read a number of Eastern religious texts and philosophical texts, they say there is no self. The self is an illusion. And I posted an article a couple of days ago talking about how some neuroscience and some philosophers are saying, you know, Buddhism has been right for the last couple thousand years, that there really is no coherent sense of self. And that is a very fascinating idea because, again, here in the US in particular, in other countries, we think of ourselves as a stable phenomenon. My character is always going to be my character. Hey, Jeffrey. And the reality is, if you look at the neuroscience research on the development of the self, and I'm going to post an article on my Patreon later that you can read all the little facts, but basically, when you look at an infant in their development, their sense of self is very simple and primal when in the first couple of years of life. They don't have complex thinking, they don't have complex self-awareness because they don't have language and critical thinking as we do as adults. So all they know is, I'm physically okay, I'm physically not okay. My needs are getting met, my needs are not getting met. Okay? So their basic sense of self is very simple. I'm okay, I'm not okay. And believe it or not, that doesn't disappear as we get older. It's still there, and we just add lots of fancy layers to it with complex thinking, social identity roles, and things of that nature as we get older. And what the neuroscience research shows is two things. One, we have particular parts of our brain in our frontal cortex as well as in our temporal lobe, which is responsible for memory and integrating ideas and facts and understanding, specifically directed to and reserved for self-understanding and self-awareness. So we literally have parts of the brain designed to be self-focused and self-reflective, to gather information and make it mean something about our physical presence, our physical being. So from a neuroscience perspective, we absolutely do have a self, in the sense that we're always self-monitoring, we always are looking at our physical body and our environment, how we're functioning in relation to the world around us. Basically, we are the kind of focus whenever we walk around and live in the world. We're always thinking with regard to who we are and what we think and what we believe. So there's neuroscience research from brilliant people showing that there's self-referential memory, and there are parts of the brain specifically focused on and devoted to who we are, how we see things, and what is it about us in relation to the world around us. So from a neuroscience perspective, they kind of contradict Buddhism in that regard. We believe because we have a physical body and we can be self-aware, we can reflect on our physical presence on this planet, that there is a self. So that's one thing to think about. However, if your philosophy is something like the Buddhist, where there is no actual self, then we actually have to get a little more deep and figure out who we really are. So if you read authors like Dan Siegel and Alan Shore, they talk about the self and the mind as a co-constructed process, as every time we are in a relationship with someone, every time we see someone meet someone, our mind dramatically changes and orients to that circumstance, and we start to change how we think and how we see things based upon that circumstance. So actually, in one way, the neuroscience research also supports the idea that our self is co-constructed. It's always there in the context of relationships. So who we are tends to vary based upon circumstances, relationships, and people that we're with. And there's some normalcy to that. Now, some people might think that's hypocrisy, that you're being fake or being a chameleon, but the neuroscience research also shows that even though we have a solid sense of who we are, like we're consistently this kind of person, that we also shift and change in different circumstances, because that's actually adaptive to shift and change. So the question then becomes, how do we define self-esteem if our sense of self is shifting and changing in every circumstance? So for me, there is no easy answer. Again, you take it from a Buddhist perspective, you take it from a materialist perspective or a constructivist perspective, you're going to answer that question differently. But I'm a man who likes kind of pragmatism. I like the simple, straightforward answer. So this is my solution for self-esteem. Again, if you think about how we develop and how our brain works, we're built to both be stable and consistent in who we think we are, because that makes us feel safe and secure. That's what the research shows. So understanding ourselves in a consistent and stable way makes us feel good and helps us function more efficiently in relationships. On the other hand, though, who we are does change from circumstance to circumstance. So although I'm sitting here talking to you all here in this way, I might speak somewhat differently when I'm hanging out with my friends, or when I'm talking to patients, or when I'm talking to family, or I'm talking to my fiance, or any number of different people. Because again, that is the norm, and that is how our brain is built to function. We are built to shift our affect, our mood, and our sense of self-understanding every time we get into a new circumstance, because new circumstances call for new ways of relating. That is what's adaptive. So I think there's an inherent duality about self-esteem, where people always say you shouldn't base your self-esteem on other people. But again, if you look at attachment research, neuroscience research, you look at people like Alan Shore and Dan Siegel, part of our healthy sense of self-esteem is co-created. It's created by being in relationships, because again, we need relationships to survive. We need relationships to feel grounded and safe and have a healthy sense of well-being. So part of our self-esteem is definitely derived from the outside world, from our relationships, from our behaviors, from our habits. And another part of our self-esteem is derived from our character and who we think we are, our self-reflective process, and things of that nature. So in this talk about self-esteem, I might have made things a little more confusing, and if I did, I'm sorry, but my goal is to just kind of give you the full breadth of the research and to fully comprehend what the truth really is about what we know. Again, so there's a philosophical agreement about the self and disagreement about the self. But then there's the neuroscience about the self. So there are distinct parts of the brain that are focused only on who we are physically as people in our existence here. It's self-reflective. But there's also a part of our brain, orbital frontal cortex and other parts, that are designed specifically for relating to people differently in different circumstances, because that's adaptive. It helps us survive and have more functional relationships. So the reality is, for self-esteem, I want to recommend two things. Whether you think you have low self-esteem or high self-esteem, I don't think it matters at this point. What matters is how we define ourselves, and then what we're doing to better ourselves if we believe a self exists, right? So if at the very least we believe our physical being exists, there are things we can do to better ourselves. And the two things I recommend are this. A, figure out who you think you are. So you can take time and sit down and reflect and journal and things like that, and just go, these are the characteristics about me that define me. My age, my height, my sexuality, my biological sex, my relationship status, my employment, my education, my culture, my family of origin, all these different things that are kind of more seemingly superficial, right? They're on the outside of us. Define yourself that way. And then the second thing in that first point is to define yourself based upon your character. Are you shy? Are you quiet? Are you loud? Are you noisy? Do you like attention? Do you not like attention? Are you boisterous? Are you angry? Are you confused? Are you depressed? And define yourself that way. So figure out who you think you really are is tip number one for better self-esteem. Number two, and this is also very simple, I want to recommend something from Dr. Dan Siegel, who is brilliant, and I want to recommend that you try and create a lifestyle of wellness that's based upon 5 characteristics that Dr. Dan Siegel discussed. So the acronym is FACES: flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. Dan Siegel says that basically the best relationships and the best brain functioning comes when we have a FACES way of being. So F stands for flexible, right? So flexibility is a real simple concept. Basically, we need to be able to understand that things change and be able to understand that change is okay and not approach things rigidly to the best of our ability. Because when we're rigid, we tend to actually function worse, have more depression, anxiety, and struggle more in relationships. So that's FACES. F, flexibility. Adaptive. Might seem like flexibility, but it's actually different. So adaptive is actually an in-the-moment process. Adaptive means, is my behavior working for my betterment and for the relationship betterment, or is it not? Will it work in such a way that makes the outcome better or worse? Right, that's what adaptive means. So flexible, adaptive of FACES. Coherent. Coherent is very important. So when Dan Siegel talks about coherence, he talks about the ability for things to work together in a fluid and fully understood way. So neurons that work in a coherent way fire better and work better, and the brain works better. Same thing with relationships and our self. If we have a coherent sense of self-understanding, that means that we understand where we come from, what's happened to us, what is the context of the things that we've been through, right? So if you were abused as a child, why? What happened? What about the experiences, the circumstances, the time, the culture, the finances? All those things go into why that happened to you, right? So in order to have a coherent self-understanding, we have to understand where we come from and why, and how we act the way we act. So we have to understand what those are, if we're in denial about things, if we have defenses that keep us from seeing ourselves, and then add as much context about who we are. Because if we miss the context, we actually just have a very narrow view of who we are. So that's coherent. So flexible, adaptive, coherent. Energized of FACES. Energized simply means appropriate energy for the circumstances. So if you're depressed, the best thing you can have is someone who has a low energy around you. Because again, if their energy matches, we actually feel better. We feel like people see us. We feel like people mirror us and reflect us. It's an empathic way to connect. And just like if we're around someone else, if the room is all big and loud and crazy, and you're all quiet and soft, it's going to be awkward. It's going to be weird. And it's going to be more off-putting to you. So the energy needs to be more matching in that way, shape, or form. And that requires negotiating. How does that energy match mine? Yours match mine, mine match yours. So we have to have appropriate energy for the circumstances. So if it's the morning, probably are kind of tired, probably need to slowly warm up, right? And don't need to be all boisterous in the morning. If you're at night, you need to chill out because, again, energy is starting to go down, naturally speaking. There are daily biorhythms, body rhythms, and we need to match our daily biorhythms in terms of our energy. So that's face. Flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized. And the last one is stable. So stable means I understand who I am and I function in such a way that is consistent over time. Because again, our brain is designed, as I was talking about earlier, to operate better and to have less anxiety, less tension whenever we see ourselves acting consistently over time. If we have stable character, we feel more safe and we function better in relationships. So stability, acting in the same way over time, is actually a good sign for mental health. And relationships work better when we're consistent and stable people. Hey, Ricky. So that's Faces by Dr. Dan Siegel. It's not mine. I didn't create it. It's all him. You can check it out at drdansiegel.com. Brilliant man. So Faces. Flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. So in this talk about self-esteem, I just want to wrap it up. I know I've been on longer than normal. I've talked about the neuroscience of the self. I've talked about how there are different philosophies and belief systems that say there is no self versus there is a self. And with regard to the neuroscience, there are two findings. We have specific parts of the brain that are biologically created, designed to keep track of our physical being, our self, our physical self, and what we think about ourselves. There's also a brain system that is designed, thanks for sharing, Christine, there's also a brain system designed to alter and adapt the self whenever we are in new circumstances with different people, because it's actually very helpful for us and adaptive for us to be different in different circumstances. So my solution for better self-esteem, if you believe a self exists, philosophically speaking, is this. A, figure out who you really are. Take a minute, take an hour, journal, reflect. Go through all the various facets of who you could be. All your social identities, job and family and friends and sports and hobbies and things like that. And then, on the other hand of that, other side, take a look at your character. Who do you think you are as a person? Are you smart? Are you stupid? Are you polite? Are you rude? Are you angry? Are you sad? Are you conflicted, generally speaking? What do you think of yourself? So step one is figure out who you really are. Take some time and meditate on it. Definitely meditate, right, Andrew? Definitely meditate and figure out who you really think you are. And the second thing is to follow Dan Siegel's model of healthy brain and healthy relationships, which is Faces. Flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. I appreciate you all coming out. I hope if you missed it that you get a chance to rewatch it at some point. It's okay, Andrew. It's okay. And I really look forward to seeing more comments and hearing more feedback about this, because I know this is a kind of a weighty topic. It's a big deal, and there's a lot going on with it. And again, it all, self-esteem basically depends upon whether or not you believe a self exists. So I believe for a fact that my physical being exists, whether or not there is a coherent sense of me everywhere, I don't know. And as we learn more from neuroscience and physics and things like that, we'll actually learn more about whether there really is more of a co-created self, and that's more of the truth, or whether or not our individual sense of self is actually what the basis of all of our relationships is, and how we see the world. To me, I think both are true. I think we have a stable sense of who we think we are, that changes with circumstances, like the neuroscience research says, that changes with time and experience. I also think that there's a natural need for us to co-create who we are in different circumstances and be flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. So this has been a very brief video on self-esteem. We can always do the regular things to boost self-esteem, like exercise, eat better, get in better shape, have better jobs, better relationships, but the best trick for that is Dan Siegel's thing, Faces. Flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. in our relationships and in how we see ourselves. Thanks for coming out, and I'll be posting this on Patreon soon with all the research and more about how the self develops. Thanks all.